Hey everyone, welcome to the Summer Rewind edition of the ThinkEnergy podcast. While we recharge our batteries during these lazy, hazy days of summer, we're bringing back some blasts from our podcast past. We'll be reintroducing some of the most popular interviews that garnered a lot of attention and interest. Perhaps not a coincidence, but they're all focused on the future of the energy sector with themes like renewable energy, green innovation, and being eco-conscious. So I hope you truly enjoy our Summer Rewind edition. In the meantime, have a happy summer, and we'll be back September 6th to kick off another exciting season of the ThinkEnergy podcast. I'm Dan Sege from Hydro Ottawa, and I'll be hosting the ThinkEnergy podcast. So here's today's big question. Are you looking to better understand the fast-changing world of energy? Join me every 2 weeks and get a unique perspective from industry leaders as we deep dive and discuss some of the coolest trends, emerging technologies, and latest innovations that drive the energy sector. So stay tuned as we explore some traditional and some quirky facets of this industry. This is the ThinkEnergy podcast. Well, everyone, welcome back. This is another episode of the ThinkEnergy podcast. In April 2019, the City of Ottawa, the nation's capital, declared a climate emergency. It was this declaration that signaled to the community at large that the municipal government was taking climate action very, very seriously. And that is why ramping up with its climate change master plan, its climate resiliency strategy, and a special project called Energy Evolution. It's clear the city recognized that municipalities can influence significant change over their own emissions. In fact, roughly 50% of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada are from municipalities. That means every town and every city in Canada can make a huge impact by tackling climate change at the municipal level, on the ground, so to speak. Municipalities can not only improve the quality of life for their residents, but also reduce greenhouse gas emissions and save money in operations and energy costs. Today we're going to focus on Energy Evolution. This is the action plan for how the City of Ottawa will meet a 100% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from its operations of the municipal government by 2040, and from the community, the entire city, by 2050. In short, its vision is clear: to transform Ottawa into a thriving city of the future powered by clean, renewable energy. Realizing Energy Evolution's vision will require concerted efforts and collaboration across all sectors of the community like never before. The strategy is guided by 3 components: reduce energy use through conservation and efficiency, increase the supply of renewable energy through local and regional production, and prioritize the procurement of clean and renewable energy. Here is today's big question: how will Ottawa, the nation's capital, go about to set its emission reduction targets, and what was the process to creating a climate action plan? Joining me today is a very special guest, Andrea Flowers, who is leading the development of the City of Ottawa's renewable energy strategy. Andrea, can you tell us a bit about you, the work that you do, and why global warming, climate change, and clean energy means so much to you?
Well, I have more than 15 years of strategic climate change planning, policy development, project management, stakeholder engagement, and public education. I've worked in the nonprofit, private, and public sector at the municipal, provincial, and federal level. And over the last year and a half or so, I've had the privilege of leading the City of Ottawa's climate change and resiliency team. I think that climate change is the political and moral challenge of our time. And I think we all have a responsibility to learn about it and take action on it.
Can you tell us a bit about why Ottawa declared a climate emergency in 2019 and why the city needs a community energy transition strategy like Energy Evolution.
Ottawa declared a climate emergency to name, frame, and deepen our commitment to protecting the economy, our ecosystem, and our community from climate change. Worldwide, climate scientists agree that fast rising global temperatures have created a climate emergency and that we need to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius in order to avoid catastrophic climate change. At this point, there's hardly a week that goes by without hearing about climate change in the news. And so cities across the country and around the world have declared climate change in order to take action on this issue and raise the profile of it. Since cities have an influence over about half the emissions in Canada, I think Ottawa, like all other cities, need a strategy like Energy Evolution to respond to climate change. I also think that cities, like all of other levels of government, have a responsibility to play in the leadership role of catalyzing the broader community and helping us all collectively rise to the challenge. In Ottawa, Energy Evolution is our strategy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the community 100% by 2050, in line with that global science. And Energy Evolution hopes to transform Ottawa into a thriving city powered by clean, renewable energy. But realizing Energy Evolution's vision will require concerted efforts and collaboration across all sectors of the community.
Andrea, wondering if you can expand on the scope and scale of changes required for Ottawa to reduce GHG emissions below the 2012 levels by 2050, and what are the short, mid, and long-term targets?
I'll start with the second part of the question for context. So as part of Council's approval of the new climate change master plan in Ottawa, short, mid, and long-term targets for greenhouse gas emissions were set, and they align with those intergovernmental panel or climate change targets, or the IPCC targets, to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So community-wide, the short-term target is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 43% by 2025, 68% by 2040, and 100% by 2050. And then the scope, scale, and the short timelines associated with those are really difficult to meet. I would say that meeting those targets will require both unprecedented action and investment across the community and around the world. So to give you a sense of what that scope and scale means, we're going to have to phase out almost all fossil fuels. That means gas, natural gas, and diesel. We're going to nearly fully electrify our heating and our cooling systems. We're going to have to nearly fully electrify or go to zero emission transportation systems for our personal vehicles, our commercial fleets, and our transit systems. We're going to have to start using more waste heat and renewable natural gas to meet our heating demands. And we're going to have to generate and store enough renewable energy, particularly electricity, mostly from wind and solar, to meet the demand and offset emissions that we currently have from Ontario's provincial grid.
Based on your analysis, what are the biggest contributors to Ottawa's greenhouse gas emissions, and how challenging will it be to shift away from those?
Well, maybe a bit of background. So Ottawa undertakes greenhouse gas emissions inventories every year so that we know where our emissions come from. And in 2018, the most recent year that we have right now, roughly 90% of the emissions in Ottawa came from the building and transportation sectors. Basically how we heat and cool our homes and how we get around the city. And if we look at those emissions and the contributing sources of emissions, then natural gas is by far the largest contributor in the community, followed by gasoline and diesel. Now, of course, given the scope and scale of the transportation system in our building sector, it's going to be really difficult to shift away from these emission sources. Governments don't have direct control over emissions, although, of course, they can influence them between policy and regulation or incentives and disincentives. But success is going to depend to a large extent on private action. It's going to take billions of dollars of public and private capital to make community-wide investments over the next 30 years. And to meet those targets that we've set. The upfront investments over the next 10 years will be the highest, but the good news is that our financial analysis shows that there'll be a net financial benefit to society at large starting in early 2030, probably around 2032, when the net annual savings start to outpace the revenues generated and the savings generated compared to the annual investments required. Beyond the financial challenges, there's lots of federal and provincial governmental regulatory barriers that prevent us from doing some of the actions required in the model. And then even beyond this, of course, there's risk that the public won't make or accept the types of changes required. And I'm cognizant of the fact that there's a huge equity and inclusion risk for this transition. We need to find ways that everybody can participate in climate solutions, and not just the people who can afford it.
In your view, do you feel that public acceptance is a challenge? Can anyone participate in climate solutions? Are there any barriers?
I'm a champion in this sector. I also own an EV, and I cycle almost everywhere. I've done deep retrofits on my home, and they're all really challenging choices to make for all kinds of reasons: where to start, how to prioritize, how to actually do it. So, I mean, those are, you're highlighting some of the other challenges in public acceptance and just our ability to make these changes.
The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has said that limiting global warming to 1.5 Celsius is possible, but will require far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. In order to achieve this at the local level, what type of changes can we expect from the city and even from ourselves?
Well, when we look at energy evolution, we've broken it down in a total of 5 sectors to figure out how we can achieve a 100% reduction by 2050. The 5 sectors are land use, buildings, transportation, waste, and renewable natural gas, and electricity. And 4 out of the 5 sectors really rely on land use as sort of a base element to the whole model. If we look at the model itself, the building and transportation sectors account for roughly 75% of all of the cumulative emission reductions from now until 2050. And the remaining 25% will have to come from waste and renewable natural gas and the electricity sectors. The model itself then takes those 5 sectors and it breaks it down into to 39 actions. And those 39 actions tell us sort of the scale of change required in each of the actions. If we think about what the top 5 emissions are, I said 75% of the reductions will come from the buildings and transportation sector, so it's no surprise that 4 of these 5 come from those areas. It includes by far the largest action, which is to electrify personal electric vehicles. So about 20% of the 100% of emissions that we need to achieve will come from the electrification of personal vehicles. The second most important action is to divert organics and create renewable natural gas. So we need to divert our kitchen waste, our yard and leaf waste away from landfills where we create very powerful GHG emission called methane. And we need to divert both methane that's produced at landfills and methane which we could capture through anaerobic digesters and create renewable natural gas. So luckily the city is right now doing a new solid waste master plan, and they are seeking input on what to do with our organics. The third most important action is to retrofit existing residential buildings, and the fourth is to retrofit existing commercial buildings. Now, we're not talking about just air sealing and new windows or insulation in the attic. We're talking about deep retrofits. We're talking about retrofits which will reduce natural gas consumption by about 60%, or at least our thermal or heating demand by about 60%. And we're talking about reducing our electrical demand by about 50%. So deep retrofits throughout the residential and commercial and institutional sectors. And then the fifth like the top 5 action is to transition to zero emission commercial fleets. And again, this will likely be electrification of commercial fleets, but we haven't ruled out fuel cells either.
Ottawa has defined its greenhouse gas emission targets and states that one of the ways it will meet them is by increasing the supply of renewable energy through local and regional production and prioritizing the procurement of clean, renewable energy. Can you walk us through the targets and how the city will increase the supply of renewable energy?
Well, achieving the 100% scenario will definitely put an increasing demand on electricity production and the delivery of electricity. So right now, renewable energy projects are required to contribute about 8.5% towards the 100% scenario by 2050. Now, the targets are aggressive. So to meet our 2030 targets under the 100% scenario, collectively, we'll have to install a significant amount of clean renewable energy. We're talking 631 megawatts of solar in the residential, commercial, and utility sectors, about 100 megawatts in wind, 18 megawatts in hydropower, and 3 megawatts in biogas. And by 2030, we'd also have to increase our storage to about 73 megawatts to reduce curtailment of renewable generation from 90% to 85%. And those are all our 2030 targets. They become even more aggressive at 2050. So how are we going to do it? What kind of things are we thinking about? Well, sort of more broadly in the community, we'd like to ramp up solar generation at a faster pace for at least the next 5 years, initially through a rooftop strategy, because on-site net metering is the only available opportunity to connect with renewable energy generation to the grid. And then also because of the relative scarcity of renewable fuels, fuel-based cogeneration can't be installed unless there's a rationale for doing so, to reduce the redundancy requirement or to support specific electricity system requirements. Existing cogen plants that don't meet these criteria should retire as opportunities arise. And we'll be looking for a sizable amount of battery or other powered storage capacity to ensure that variable renewable generation can be shifted as periods of surplus vary between high demand and the relative curtailment of renewable generation.
What are some of the benefits that your project, Energy Evolution, will bring to the city and its residents? Does it include economic development, and maybe what else?
There's lots of benefits associated with energy evolution beyond the obvious reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. Certainly economic development is a key one. From that perspective, supporting Ottawa's local businesses in the transition towards a low carbon economy will help companies reduce their operating costs, and it represents an opportunity to create good quality local jobs and attract investment. Right now, Ottawans spend about $3 billion a year on energy costs, and most of that leaves the city. So if we can generate more energy locally, we can keep a greater share of the energy dollars within our local economy. Canada's clean energy sector is growing faster than almost any other sector, and it's attracting tens of billions of dollars in investment every year. Already, our clean energy sector accounts for about 300,000 jobs in Canada, and as part of the financial analysis and part of the energy and emissions modeling we did for Energy Evolution, we looked at job creation, and we predict for building retrofits alone, we could generate as many as 38,000 jobs here in Ottawa. And then to your other part of your question, beyond economic development, there's also other benefits. From a public health perspective, we expect that air quality could improve as we move away from fossil fuels, causing a reduction in health-related effects like heart disease and breathing problems. We hope that physical and mental health would improve as we get out and cycle and walk more instead of using personal vehicles. We may see an improvement in sleep patterns as we reduce noise levels from vehicles as we transition from fuels to electric vehicles, which are much quieter, and as we insulate our buildings to improve our heating. And then finally, there's also benefits associated with energy security and resiliency. with an increasing number of extreme events like ice storms and tornadoes. Increasing our local renewable generation and supply provides affordable energy to residents and businesses and could help with uninterrupted levels of service during those extreme weather events.
Through an energy lens, what role will conservation and efficiency play in lowering greenhouse gas emissions for Ottawa? Where is that low-hanging fruit?
Well, Energy Evolution's model is built on a conservation first scenario. It uses an integrated model approach. So if conservation doesn't happen first, we will effectively just run out of zero emission energy. The model looks at conservation and efficiencies across all sectors, including buildings, transportation, electricity, and natural gas. And really the low hanging fruit in that list is the electrification of private vehicles. So a gas powertrain has a fuel to wheels efficiency in the 20 to 30% range, whereas a battery electric is more like a 90% efficiency range. So in our modeling, there's no other single measure which conserves as much primary energy as the conversion from gas or diesel to electric vehicles.
Not to brag, but Hydro Ottawa has been in the renewable energy business for more than 130 years. And currently has built-in clean generation to power a third of the city. Andrea, how important was it to engage with strategic partners like Hydro Ottawa and Envari Energy Solutions?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you. It's amazing that Hydro Ottawa and their subsidiaries have become such a leader in green energy, and it is critical for us to work with partners like Hydro Ottawa. Throughout the development of Energy Evolution, we've worked with more than 200 strategic partners and technical experts, and we know that the city alone can't achieve the scale of emission reductions required and that everybody has a role to play. Fortunately, Hydro Ottawa and its subsidiaries, Envari and Portage Power, have been there since the beginning of the Energy Evolution process. They've provided input, technical expertise, and you've been very generous about creating platforms like this one to amplify the messaging and engage broader audiences. Without Hydro Ottawa, it is highly unlikely that Energy Evolution could succeed. The 100% GHG reduction scenario foresees electrical demand more than doubling by 2050. So we need to work together to align our planning and forecasting, identify opportunities, and advocate together for policy changes at the provincial level. It's wonderful that Hydro Ottawa has a long history of renewable energy generation, and we need to keep expanding it. As I said earlier, local generation is key to meeting our targets since the province doesn't currently have plans to generate electricity with a zero emissions grid, and because there's so many opportunities for economic development here locally.
The transport sector accounts for approximately a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions and is one of the major sectors where emissions are still rising. Electrification is widely considered an attractive solution for reducing the oil dependency and environmental impact of road transportation. Where does the city stand with electrification of fleets like buses, EV charging stations, and maybe e-bikes?
Yeah, well, I'll go back to the beginning of the question for a minute, because if transportation sector accounts for a quarter of global emissions, it's actually quite a bit higher in Ottawa. So community-wide, in 2018, Ottawa's transportation sector accounted for about 44% of Ottawa's GHG emissions. And partly that's because we don't have a large industrial base here in Ottawa, whereas globally that would play a more significant role. But 44% of emissions in Ottawa are coming from the transportation sector. And in order to meet our 100% scenario target, transportation will need to account for about 37% of our GHG reduction targets, emissions. The city's corporate target is to reduce GHG emissions 100% by 2040. And you'll notice that that's about 10 years earlier than the community. So in the model for our city operations, the model calls for fleets, including our own transit and municipal fleets like bylaw, police, and ambulance, calls for our fleets to be zero emission by 2030, and then our commercial fleets to be up to, could take a bit longer, up to 2040. But the transition to zero emission must be a steady and incremental progress. We can't hit the target by backloading the model because then the emissions are compounded. And although we expect that electrification will be key for the electrification of fleets, we haven't totally ruled out fuel cells. We have, however, ruled out internal combustion powertrains, even if they use a carbon neutral fuel, because they simply aren't as efficient. In terms of where does the city stand with electrification of our fleets and buses, the city has a corporate policy to include EV chargers at all new facilities, and we're considering revising the policy to include EV chargers when we do major renovations or retrofits at city facilities. We continue to grow our own electric fleet. Just in the last couple of weeks, the City of Ottawa has purchased 4 new Hyundai Konas for bylaw services, and there's some great information on energy evolution at ottawa.ca about that. And then in terms of public chargers, our general stance is that we don't want to have any additional barriers to purchasing private electric vehicles. So we want to do what we can to ensure that there is sufficient public charging in municipal facilities and on municipal lands to support that. So the city is installing a new fast charger at Bob Macquarie, and it'll be a 150 kilowatt fast charger. And then we've partnered with Hydro Ottawa and Envari to install 13 new double-header chargers on city rights-of-way throughout the city. So those will be going in hopefully by the end of 2020. Back to the question around e-bikes. We're encouraged by developments in e-bikes and e-scooters, and they certainly fit broadly under active transportation in the energy evolution strategy, but we haven't yet given them any detailed focus, though there is increasing interest amongst the public, and it's a gap that we know we haven't addressed yet.
As an example of conservation and efficiency, are you able to talk about the city's LED streetlight conversion project and what the results have been?
Well, overall, it's been a resounding success. We've already met our energy and maintenance targets. Maintenance savings have given a knockoff reduction in GHG emissions from a reduction in the deployment of service vehicles. And I would say generally the project seems to have helped with general widespread acceptance of conservation. And that helps us sell the concept of conservation in other areas across the city and the community as well. By the end of the project, I think that we will have changed more than 58,000 light fixtures to LEDs, and we will have reduced our energy by 60%, reduced GHG emissions by 1,000 tons per year, and our operating costs by close to $5 million. So a resounding success. We've also seen co-benefits like reduced light pollution, and although I've yet to confirm it with a biologist, I've heard anecdotally that the conversion of LED lights is starting to bring back fireflies into the city because the different color of light makes it easier for the fireflies to communicate amongst themselves. So on my to-do list is to confirm that with a biologist, but I think it is an interesting little tidbit, and I choose to think that it may be true.
Okay, you alluded to this earlier, so wondering if you could expand on what role will energy storage have in lowering the city's carbon future?
Thermal storage, renewable natural gas, and battery storage all have a role to play in meeting Ottawa's GHG reduction targets. Thermal storage will likely be the most important kind of storage, both seasonally and on a shorter term basis. So seasonally or longer term storage will be important for how we operate geothermal systems, and shorter term storage will be more building specific and could help us shave peak demands. Although we call exclusively for renewable natural gas in the model, the gas grid will provide less energy than it does today, and it will continue to be a large source of storage, likely able to meet all demand without any supply for several weeks. And then finally, we need battery storage in the 100% model for electrical grid stability to manage variable generation. Battery storage is required to reduce the curtailment of renewable generation during periods of low demand. And although it's not modeled, we see the potential for storage to help with the economic competitiveness of electricity. And this ultimately will be important in helping Ottawa achieve our targets.
Okay, Andrea, let's close this off with some rapid fire questions. I hope you're ready.
Ready.
What is your favorite word?
Zither. It's just a fun word to say. It's a quirky instrument, like a harp you play on your lap. And I've had one since a child, and it's it's a fun word to say. I play the zither.
What is the one thing you can't live without?
My man.
What is something that challenges you?
The status quo.
If you had one superpower, just one, what would it be?
The ability to show people the future so that we could really see what the consequences of our actions and our decisions are.
If you could turn back time and talk to your 18-year-old self, what would you tell her?
I would say just follow a path of love and you will find love in all aspects of your life. Trust that the things that you're interested in will lead you interesting places, and that the path might not always be clear, but there will always be something interesting along the way.
And lastly, what do you currently find most interesting in your sector?
The intersection between science and politics. It's complex and interconnected and evolving quickly, so it is ever changing.
Well, Andrea, we've reached the end of another episode of the ThinkEnergy podcast. I hope you had a lot of fun. Last question for you. How can our listeners learn more about you, your organization? How can they connect?
Well, to be honest, I think that they need to learn less about me and more about the important work that the city is doing, and this project in particular, Energy Evolution. If you want to learn more about climate change in Ottawa, then you can visit ottawa.ca/climate change, and there you'll find links to both the mitigation work we do on how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions like Energy Evolution, as well as our adaptation work and how we will build a more resilient future for Ottawa in the face of a changing climate. So lots of ways and lots of other ways to connect on there. You can go to ottawa.ca/climate change or ottawa.ca/energy evolution. There you have a chance to sign up for our e-newsletter, which focuses on climate change. You can learn more about the projects and how to get involved. And you can take a survey that tells us what kind of barriers you face on implementing climate action.
Thank you for joining us today. I truly hope you enjoyed this episode of the ThinkEnergy podcast. For past episodes, make sure you visit our website, hydroottawa.com/podcast. Lastly, if you found value in this podcast, be sure to subscribe. Anyway, this podcast is a wrap. Cheers, everyone.